thanks for tuning in. As always, this is Reverend JR. And today I just wanted to remind you how great pineapple is when it's on pizza. With that out of the way, today we're going to take a look at this Feminist.com article. Patriarchy is contraindicated for life, by Carla Goldstein, Juris Doctor. So clearly, someone who understands things like the law and perhaps not so much about cultural anthropology. Let us continue. Carla Goldstein, Chief External Affairs Officer at Omega and co-founder of the Omega Women's Leadership Center, discusses why the need for a women's movement is just as timely as ever. I agree. If women want things like the right to vote, then they ought to be required to enlist in the draft, as I am required to do. I wonder if we're going to talk about that at all down here. Wonder if it'll be relevant. She begins. It's hard to imagine a more fitting way to celebrate International Women's Day than to usher in the end of patriarchy. Well, maybe she will discuss it. While the path forward will not be easy, that's right, if all women are suddenly required to join the draft the same as me, it will certainly be more difficult. In fact, that was a reason women originally did not want to vote, because they did not want to be required to draft. Even Steve Bannon recently declared the certainty of its demise, pronouncing, "This anti-patriarchy movement is going to undo 10,000 years of recorded history. May it be so, because patriarchy is contraindicated for life." So basically, this lady is happy that we are going to destroy the cultures that we spent 10 millennia building. Sounds kind of like some other religions I've heard of. The origin of patriarchy. The story of patriarchy goes something like this. Modern human beings have been around for about 200,000 years. More or less, that's correct. Until about 10,000 years ago, when agriculture was adopted, we lived in primarily egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. They were not egalitarian. The men were the ones who went hunting because the women had to stay home and be safe so that the chances of having lots of children would be improved. Women were a valuable resource in the fact that they can make babies, and men were a valuable resource in the fact that they could go out and hunt the food to bring home to the women to have babies. The thing is, it wasn't egalitarian at all. Women were often given preference in certain things and men in others. It was simply a society which worked to produce more offspring, and the most efficient way at that time happened to be very unegalitarian. There's a reason they were tribal, and there were many tribes that all fought with each other and took each other as prisoners or slaves to increase their own numbers. It was not primarily egalitarian. It was more like a nuclear family, I suppose. But wait, this is feminism. Let's not talk about that. Our relationship with nature was deeply integrated and of spiritual significance. Where have I heard this before? When we shifted to agriculture as our primary food source, everything changed. Or, yeah, because now the men didn't have to risk their lives hunting mastodons and deer and elephants and lions and horses for food. They could now domesticate some of those animals, use them to their advantage, but the men were still the ones doing the share of the dangerous work, while the women, for the most part, had babies and made clothes and gathered foods, the much less dangerous jobs, so that the chance of more babies was increased. But again, if you're looking at it from the idea of the nuclear family being good, and women being barefoot in the kitchen and men being the breadwinners, then yes, in a sense it is egalitarian, in that everyone was expected to do their specific part based on their gender role, so that the entire tribe could benefit. Which is an odd thing to hear that a feminist might be encouraging, don't you think? Agriculture required something new. Yes, it required many new things. Instead of traveling lightly on the earth, we needed to control land, which led to the concept of property and its ownership. I mean, no. You've got to remember, it also required putting animals into their sexual categories, keeping the female animals safe as we domesticated them, so they could also continue to create offspring, and letting the male of the species be the lion's share of the meat animals, or the hunting dogs, and so on. We also needed to control labor to work the land, and women and girls became the primary source of labor. No, they didn't. Not even when they were slaves. As men accumulated property and wealth, the need to control who became heirs arose. No, that also existed in dynastic countries, like with the Mongols, who were not farmers at all. Like in ancient China, when hunting was still a big thing and agriculture was only kinda new. Leading to the need to control women's sexuality, so that offspring remained in the man's family line. No, that's a much more royal proposition. In a lot of cases, the sexuality was controlled, so to speak, to create the most efficient offspring. The only people who had the luxury of worrying about their family line were the very rich. And the very rich had no problem enslaving people, and then those males having no say to any kind of family line, while the women stayed alive as vessels in a more comfortable life to create better offspring to serve the slaver's purpose more efficiently. You can see this in your feudal caste systems, or even the caste system in India today, or various slavery systems throughout history, and so on. It's hardly a patriarchal thing, especially if you look at the matriarchies of the European continent for the past few thousand years as well. Under this new property framework, women lost almost all of their autonomy. So did men, and became the property of their fathers and husbands, as did all their slaves, and concubines, and subjects, and ruling classes, and so on. It did not affect just women. As agriculture took hold, people settled down to live in one place. Not really, though. They still lived on the countryside, many of them still hunted, and a lot of them would change tribes. Think of all the people you know, or think of all the people, the famous ones in history, who moved around a lot even though farms exist. Yes, there was once a time when we required over half of our population to grow food for the whole population, but here in America, we can grow all that food with less than 1% of the population now. That said, working on farms was more advantageous if you could go to where the farms needed to be worked on, rather than just staying around your own one. We also discovered that as well. More complex societies formed, first as villages, then towns and cities, and civilization was born. I mean, that's more or less correct. During this period, institutions were created to address the new complexity, including law, economy, political structures, and the state, and patriarchy was written into the very foundations of these institutions. No, it wasn't. Again, a lot of them had queens, and a lot of them favored the women as holy and put them on a separate status entirely from men, so that they did not have to engage in the politics, and thereby extension not engage in the wars and conflicts and other very bad things that only men were conscripted into. Which is weird when you think it's patriarchal that you would be sacrificing your men to protect the women. The spread of patriarchy. It took about 2,500 years for patriarchy to spread to almost every corner of the world. Citation needed. Even in matrilineal and egalitarian indigenous cultures, again there weren't many, the power of patriarchy was so strong it often influenced gender relationships. That's correct. Like how men were the ones always required to do dangerous stuff, and women were given a protected status because they could make the babies. As the patriarchy spread, a justifying narrative emerged. Men and women are inherently different creatures. We are. Men cannot have babies. You even bring up agriculture. You must understand how breeding works, both in the way they were created and in the social function assigned by nature or God. Right. If a lot of men die, society can still repopulate. If a lot of women die, society cannot. Why it took so long to challenge the patriarchy? Because the human lifespan is so short, the gripping force of this story, coupled with barring women from access to power of any kind, No, just like with suffrage, men had the power to vote because they were conscripted into the draft. Women wanted that power. Some women, the majority of women not fighting for suffrage, actually. But the few women who did fight for suffrage did not find themselves fighting also for the access to the responsibility of signing up for the draft. You claim that you want power, but you do not want the responsibility that goes with it. Not you specifically, but the people I'm addressing here. So the point remains. It took women about 3,500 years to challenge their own subordination. And again, just like with suffrage, the majority of them didn't want to change their own subordination because they didn't want to die on the front lines of some godforsaken rock in another country because someone ran a sword through them. And it was only just over 100 years ago that women began taking significant collective action to make change. But you're still not required to sign up for the selective service to avoid getting a felony that will disqualify you from voting. It's been history's longest standing case of oppression. No. History's longest standing case of oppression is expecting that every man should be a warrior, and then forcing them to be. After a century of feminist activism, inspired initially by Native American egalitarian culture, again, where the men were the hunters and the women were the baby makers. Show me which Native American culture breaks that stigma. Which Native American culture doesn't expect men to become great warriors. And the abolitionist movement, you do realize that slavery affected men and women, right? Oppressed them equally, and actually made the men's lives potentially worse by forcing them to do the most dangerous jobs, while the women acted as vessels of breeding. I'm not saying that's better, but I'm saying a combine doesn't take your leg off, or a horse doesn't trample you, if you're not working with those machines all day. There are real signs that patriarchy is coming to an end. No, there are signs that the matriarchy already exists, like in how child custody works, or in how alimony payments work, or child support. Women still have clear privilege in a great many areas, but we are much more egalitarian than we were 100 years ago. Thanks to the powerful leadership of women of color. What about the men of color who were also oppressed? We'll just ignore them? There was a patriarchy, and they were men, but they were still oppressed, but you're not going to mention them. Current day movements like Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Women's March, and Me Too, except when you try to point out that men are black, men are the ones who filled the tombs of the unknown soldiers, and so on, have laid the groundwork for a new intersectional and more impactful wave of resistance and change. I mean, it's definitely a wave of change, but it's definitely not egalitarian, it is gynocentric. Additionally, as women have gained increasing access to power, sure, why not? And as communications technology has grown, connection across previously impenetrable boundaries has created momentum. Sure, why not? Anything can spread faster when the spread of knowledge is easier, including herpes. Nature is inherently cooperative. I'd also like to take a moment to apologize. This video is long, but this is where the real fun stuff starts. Alongside social change efforts, exciting new science supports overturning the old dog-eat-dog narrative that long supported patriarchy with its premise that dominance is an inherent human condition. So, when she says nature is inherently cooperative, is she talking about how bears eat salmon, and how trees block out other trees so that they can get more sunlight, and how various species will compete with each other to be predator or prey? It doesn't seem all that cooperative to me in the sense that she's trying to elicit. This will make more sense in a few moments. The evidence increasingly supports what indigenous cultures knew all along, that nature is inherently cooperative. Hey, remember how we got rid of all the apex predators apart from ourselves to make our society better to live in for the general human, so that most of us aren't dying to lion attacks or bear attacks and so on? But you know, nature's inherently cooperative. The bears would have just left us alone, I'm sure. We didn't have to wipe them out to have a safer place to live. Snakes, mice, and so on. According to biologist and founder of the biomimicry field, Janine Benyus, the organisms that survive and thrive on planet Earth are the ones that create conditions conducive to life. Right, as I was saying, our dominance over the creatures that would eat us happens to create a condition conducive to life. The fact that we were able to domesticate and domineer dogs is very indicative of this. It turns out the cooperative, generous, and diverse networks are the primary organizing principle of the universe. No, it isn't. The primary organizing principle of the universe is gravity, or maybe dark matter. And nature uses genius techniques to avoid conflict and competition. Right. By making one species stronger than the other, so the other acts as prey for it. But no, there has always been conflict and competition. That's why we have to hunt bears to nearly extinction, just to make it safe for us to live in the areas they were once in. The same way we have to destroy polio if we don't want it destroying us. Since human beings are organisms, this lady is a Juris Doctor, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad she understands that human beings are organisms. She probably doesn't understand why this is a false analogy, but I digress. If we want to survive and thrive like other organisms, we too have to create conditions conducive to life, like confining animals to farms so we can eat them, or controlling the land in a domineering fashion to produce food almost exclusively for us and the things we eat. Yes, humans have very little conflict with other species anymore, but that's only because we dominated the environment. And if we didn't, some other species eventually would have, like the dinosaurs did once upon a time. This is the great work of our time. I agree, agriculture is pretty grand, and the way we've modernized it is definitely amazing. Becoming a human family, where cooperation, equality, and taking care of each other and the planet are integral to all we do. Maybe, taking care of the planet definitely, but arguably that's only because of our self-interest in not dying. You see, once you've taken over the planet, you don't really have to exert much dominance to keep that status quo. But you had to exhibit an insane amount of it just to get to that point. There's a reason we're trying to stretch out to other planets, because we know this one will kill us if we don't get off of it. We have done all the domination we can of this planet, so the best we can do is take care of it and hope to find another. Mushrooms, yes, mushrooms can be our mentors. This is the part that I actually thought was the most interesting. In addition to looking at indigenous creatures for wisdom about how to do this, we can turn to elder organisms as our mentor. One of the oldest organisms that illustrates this new understanding of cooperation is the mushroom. Mushroom fungus, yes, which has been around for over 100 million years, has become known as the Wood Wide Web. But see, there's the thing. We have a particular sort of fungus known as arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. I don't think you would call them mushrooms, but keep that in mind. These mycorrhizal fungi. Mushroom filament strands create a network that connects 90% of all trees and land plants under the earth. Actually, approximately 80% of all terrestrial plants are involved, but okay, fair enough. The network shuttles nutrients, information, and warning signals between the plants. This is true. It's very interesting how it works. The arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, they actually do this sort of function. So let's continue. For example, the Wood Wide Web allows a tall tree that has access to the sun to give the nutrients to the tree that is blocked by the shade, although in practice, generally, dying trees give their stuff back and that sort of thing. But yes, there is a symbiosis. It's a mutualistic relationship. Trees with big roots hold on to water and share it through the web to plants with small roots, and plants will help other kinds of organisms throughout the web, not just kin. Although it's not actually the trees that are helping, it's the fungus that is. And an important thing about these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi is that they are unique among fungus in that they happen to be strictly asexual. They don't have to worry about which member of their species will pass on its genes. Similarly They are not a social creature in the sense that we think of social creatures. They simply happen to make their living passing the nutrients between trees and so on. Literally farming the trees for their purposes. But again, they have no need to be a dominant species because any of their number can reproduce at will. Humans cannot do this. Similarly, could you imagine what would happen if humans tried to just go out in the wild and communicate wolves with rabbits? Do you think that would be conducive to our livelihood? Creating conditions conducive to life. And here's the part where we reach the contradiction of things like the women's rights movement, and in fact, all other human rights movements, is the fact that things like Juris Doctors or YouTube videos creators are not conducive to life. You just told us how mushrooms can be our mentors because they forego the power structure, but then you're telling us how women should have all the power and how men should have none of it to create a condition conducive to life. And that is self-contradictory. Is it good for women to attain positions of power, or should we be mutualistic and not have positions of power? Cooperation is pulsing through the universe. Tell that to a dying star. Which is why patriarchy is contraindicated for life. So, the idea that people being in power is contraindicated for life. Which is why women seek power in the women's movement. Wait a minute, what? No, seriously not. It can't be right. If we are going to survive and thrive, as we've done for the past 200,000 years, dominance as the driving force must come to an end. Why? So far, our dominance has given us an almost ideal world to live in, devoid of most predators that could end our race, like polio or lions. The good news is that from an organism point of view, human beings are still in our infancy. Not really. We're almost at the end of our timeline if we don't fix Earth. And we have time for learning and course corrections. One of the greatest strengths of the feminist movement is its central chord of optimism that the world can be different. No, the greatest strength of the feminist movement is arguing that feminists should be in power instead of anyone else, regardless of the qualifications of anyone involved. I wonder why this lady feels that she needs to be a Juris Doctor, a proper accredited thing, when she could just say, well, I'm a woman, so I should be that thing. Remember, men have to work for those too, and in the feminist ideal of equality, women should not have to work for those things because they should just be given them. But I digress. In every corner of the world, we are making progress. Presumably by we, she means the people who are overthrowing the system that's worked for 2,000 millennia. We are moving towards a new paradigm where we #do power differently. How's that working out for you? By creating conditions conducive to life, being cooperative, generous, diverse, and networked. Except those aren't conducive to life. You need more than that. You need someone to take charge and say, here's how the farm should be ran. In Europe, we didn't have that for a long time. You had the communal areas which were not allowed to be owned by anyone, which were owned by everyone, so that everyone could do whatever they wanted upon them. And without the power structure to say, here are the best farming practices, and the laws to say, don't violate these practices, farming would have never taken off. Without the kind of dominance of having a person who knows what they're doing in the position of power to say what needs to be done. The same as it's been for all of human history, learning from the people that are most successful to train you how to be successful. Whether that's hunting, baby making, developing anti-vaccines, or whatever. Sounds a lot like feminism to me, and like #times up on patriarchy. Just let me know, lady, when you want to fight for my right not to be in the draft in order to get my right to vote. Anyway, that's gonna be the end of this one. I just felt like making another video today. Don't get too complacent. If you enjoyed that, click the thumbs up. If you want to know how to get your names here, check out my Patreon. And that's gonna be it for today. As always, thanks for tuning in, and this has been Reverend JR, signing off.